So let's go through these one by one. I'm going to start from the bottom, not for any particular reason. If a customer can do it, you can mechanize it. I think we've hopefully said this enough times that most people believe that unless we're talking about the customer like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, pretty much if a customer can do the action, we can somehow capture it. So I would argue that the last statement in blue is generally true about both kinds of tests, so that means that it isn't the right answer. Integration level tests rely less on detailed knowledge about the structure of the code. Well, that's also a true statement. Like we said before, the only thing that they're really relying on in terms of the code structure is as seen from the point of view of the web browser, right? I stimulate the app through the browser, the app gives a reply back to me through the browser, and I don't know very much about what happens in between, but I can still write a high-level, sort of a cucumber-level scenario like a user story about that. So this statement, I would argue, is also true, therefore not the right answer. What about they're just as likely to be unexpectedly dependent on the production database? So this is a situation that arises, and by the way, here's a preview. This statement also tends to be true, therefore not the right answer. And why is that? Because a lot of times, when you're writing a test that manipulates some data, whether it's a unit level test, a function level test, or a high level user story, especially in an application where there are relationships among models, the behavior of the test may rely on certain relationships being in place across model instances. For example, a certain type of model might only be valid if it's associated with, like it has one or has many, of another type of model, which also has to be valid. So one challenge that arises when you're trying to get code running in a development environment is if you have a very large production database, too large to conveniently clone into development, you might say, well, I'll just take a subset of the rows of each table and use that. Well, it might be that there's validity constraints that are encoded across database tables, and by taking subsets of rows without understanding what those relationships are, you might end up with data in your development environment that actually isn't valid. And you might start making incorrect assumptions about problems with the code, where in fact, the problem is that you took a snapshot of the database, a subset of the database, that isn't really a valid subset. So this second one is actually just as much of a pitfall for integration tests as it is for unit level ones, right? If I run the integration test against the remote site, it works great, and then I subset the database for the development site, that same integration test might not necessarily work because there's some assumption that I didn't know about, or there was some relationship among data models that I wasn't making. So that leaves us with integration tests are based on fewer assumptions about how the code works. Surprisingly, that's not necessarily true. In fact, you could argue that there are cases where you're making more assumptions about how the code works because you're exercising it at a much coarser granularity. So from the time that you submit the request to the server and to the time that you get something back, there's a lot of code executing in there, right? How do you know that what you did isn't dependent on the phase of the moon or the time of the day or the fact that the server is more loaded versus less loaded, right? Maybe the same action gives you different results under heavy load that it gives you under light load. This is famously what CNN did after 9/11. They actually changed their code path so that under very heavy load, they would just show you the top headline on the page. Under normal load, they would show you the full rich CNN experience. So in fact, people often think that because characterization tests at the integration level are so high level that they actually are making fewer assumptions about how the code works. If anything, they may be making more assumptions because you're touching more code with less understanding of what that code does. So these are all potential pitfalls, but the top one is the one that I would look out the most for, and therefore I consider that the right answer.